just turned it on. So it's good to have all of you here tonight. I hope you're doing well. We are in the Gospel of Luke chapter 9 tonight, the Gospel of Luke chapter 9. And we are toward the end of the chapter. Again, we've been in this chapter for a little bit, but that's because as far as the Gospel of Luke is concerned, it is a pivotal chapter with so much going on. As the apostles, starting with Peter, have confessed who Jesus is. You've got the Mount of Transfiguration, feeding 5,000, and now that we have Jesus telling 3 times that he is going to go to Jerusalem and be arrested and suffer, killed, and resurrected 3 days later. So all of that is taking place. But there are still some things for the disciples. So the last few things we'll look at in this chapter are going to be about Jesus and the disciples. And then we'll get started at least with the parable of the Good Samaritan. So let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. Father, we are grateful to you for the opportunity to be here tonight, the opportunity to gather together and to, at this moment, study a portion of your word, and to be encouraged by each other and to build one another up. And for this purpose and this class, to study the life of Christ, not just so that we can gain in knowledge and have information, but so that ultimately through the truth of your word, we would be transformed from the inside out, and that we would think and speak and act more like Jesus in each passing moment of our life. We thank you for being patient with us. We thank you for being kind to us. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. So I left you again at the end of last week when we're going to pick up with verse 46. And I left you with just this mentioning of the argument. It's the first of 2 arguments that the disciples are going to have. And it's all about the same subject. They're going to argue about who is the greatest. So this is the first one. The second one will be where James and John go to Jesus and they send their mama on their behalf and, hey, Mama, can you put in a good word for us? So that exchange will come up again. But this word argument that many of you probably have in your translation means to dispute. It's a verbal exchange involving a clash of ideas. So we said, what is the idea being argued? Who is the greatest? So you've been here with us, or just in general, just rely on your own memory. What's the irony of the 12 arguing amongst themselves about who is the greatest? What's the irony of this? It's the irony of them arguing at the end of this chapter about who is the greatest.
It's all about being a servant, and they hadn't gotten that yet.
Okay. So it's amazing on one hand that Peter, speaking for all 12, they get it mentally who Jesus is. You're the Christ. You're the Son of God, all of these wonderful things. And then in less than a week later, they reveal they hadn't gotten all of it. And that the kingdom is a lot different than what they're possibly imagining in all of this. So we see that the 12 are the ones who are arguing. In verse 47, something is told to us about Jesus. What's said? What's said about him? He knew their thoughts. Have we seen this phrase before in the gospel since we've been studying it? Who is that phrase in reference to? It's Pharisees. This is the first time this phrase will now be used not for anybody on the outside, but for somebody on the inside. So why tell us this about Jesus? You got the 12, they're arguing, they're having this clash of ideas, and the idea is, no, I'm better than you, greater than you, whatever it may be. Why tell us, when it comes to the 12, that Jesus knows their heart? He knows their thoughts. Why tell us this?
It's another reason to know that he is God.
Okay.
Also, they probably, at this point in time, after seeing what he's done and talking about his death, they probably would have brought this in front of him and argued in front of him. Ask him. So, it make him make a decision. So he knew already what they were thinking. So
Okay.
curtail the problem.
So this may be an illusion. So one is the fact that he is still God and he is divine. But the other may be alluding to the fact that they've quietly argued among themselves. If you read Mark's account, they're kind of up ahead of him in traveling. And Jesus will ask them, hey, what were you discussing? What were you asking? But Luke is going to have him already know. So whether they're trying to keep it quiet, hey, we don't want Jesus to hear us, he's probably tired, we're still going to argue about this. Nothing is hidden from him. Whether you're on the outside or the inside, nothing's hidden from him. Go ahead.
I think if that comment were left out that Jesus already knew, then it wouldn't be as pointed when he brings the little child and gives this demonstration about whoever welcomes this little child in my name. It's kind of, he knows what they're talking about, and he's doing this as, you know what, you guys really ought to be thinking about this, not thinking about that.
Okay, yeah, really, really good point. Because it's going to really add an emphasis with his object lesson, for a lack of a better way of putting it. So before we get to the child, what is behind the argument of who is the greatest? Since he knows their thoughts, he knows their hearts, what's actually going on that gives inside of them individually? What's going on inside of them that gives birth to the fact that we've seen him transfigured, we've seen him feed 5,000. We've seen him heal a boy that we couldn't heal, feed people we couldn't feed. 3 of us saw him transfigured. He delivered us from the boat, all of those things. Yet what rock or rocks, what thorns are in their hearts that gives birth to the fact that we're going to spend all of our time not discussing that and the fact that he's God and what amazing things. We're going to spend our time arguing about who's the greatest. What's in their hearts? What are some things that's in their hearts? Okay, so one of those that we do know of, they are thinking physical, not spiritual. What else are they? What else is clouding their heart? What other rocks, what other thorns are taking up their heart? Okay, envy would be one. I would agree with you. And just considering the event, now let's take the transfiguration, who would have been envious of who? Or jealous of who? Okay, and just from a human point of view, what are the 3 probably thinking about themselves compared to the 9? Okay. We're the favorite. I'm the favorite. Peter could have done that. And if you have the 9, just by observing, nothing said, so I'm not going to say this is 100%. But if they're arguing about who's the greatest, it's pretty possible. We're very possible that 9 are jealous and envious. Why do they get to go and we don't? And the other 3 are, we got to go and you didn't. That's very possible in playing a role in this. So envy or jealousy, pride, pride would be there. What else would be there that's possibly playing a role that gives birth to this argument?
They have motivation
Okay.
to be associated with pleasing, who normally do a lot of what's good.
Okay, so it would be, especially to what Jessica mentioned, especially if it's physical. Once the kingdom comes in, from a physical standpoint, we need to be, rubbing shoulders, rubbing elbows. This guy's going to usher this in. We've got a motivation for this, but there's a word that we would attach to the phrase motivation. Self. In the end of the day, who are the 12 looking out for? Themselves. Individually. So it's selfishness that possibly is jealousy is there, pride is there, and eventually what happens, and I'm using rocks and thorns because remember, the previous chapter, we had the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower explains everything that we're going through. Every body, every group, whatever it is, it explains. It explains you, it explains me, it explains the people we live with, it explains the people we work with. It just goes on and on. And how many times have arguments started because one or both are selfish? How many times have clashes happened because one or both are thinking of themselves above the other? How many have started arguments and how many verbal exchanges have taken place that are unpleasant or just downright awful because we were jealous or we were envious or because we were prideful? These are rocks and these are thorns that can stifle. And look at what it did. They have no leg to stand on about who's the greatest because they could not feed 5,000. They could not save themselves in the boat. They could not deliver the boy out, the demon, take the demon out of the boy. Why are you arguing? In light of all of that, why are you arguing about who's the greatest? That's the irony.
Well, they're disappointed with themselves that
Could,
they couldn't.
could be.
You know, he gave them the power to do it, and then
Sure.
they weren't able to, so they are saying, well, who can do it then?
That could be disappointment in that.
Now, I'm reading into this, but can you imagine the story that Peter may have told the nine when he came back, he saw Moses and Elijah?
Yep.
He saw them. They were there. They witnessed something that was miraculous, unbelievable, and the others were left out. So they're like, hey, what's my position now?
Yep.
You guys, you three are up there.
Yep.
What am I? And the jealousy and the envy as well as, you know, when you're in that position, you don't want the guy that can make the decision to know.
Yeah.
Because you can be equal as long as he says you're not. Okay? As long as there's not a final say. So
Yeah.
they can argue among themselves, but I can't imagine the stories that those guys told each other when they got back.
Yeah, and then if just in,
Were they told not to tell?
he did. They were told not to tell.
I just can't imagine them not.
But they were told not to, but we see plenty of people still telling when they do it. And it's very possible just in the passive aggressive, and again, reading into it. But man, if we didn't have to come down with you people, if y'all could have just done what you were supposed to do, we could have stayed up there. I'm reading into some of it. The point being is, don't forget the rocks and the thorns in our own hearts. That we may not be, a lot of us probably are so familiar with this. I don't want to be the greatest. I don't want to stand up here, or I don't want to do any of that. But sometimes I just want to be heard. We talked a little bit about this Sunday morning in conflict. Conflict resolution. Somebody somewhere has got to have the humility and not the pride. Somebody somewhere has got to do this. And the beautiful thing about it, but it's the hard thing, and this was your point, Glenn, a minute ago, he is going to put one of the greatest object lessons that if you really want to be great and you want to make a race, don't make a race to the top, make a race to the bottom. And nobody wants to make a race to the bottom. Nobody wants to make a race to the back of the line. Nobody wants to be in the front of the line. So you mentioned this already. Ultimately, what's the wisdom of bringing a child? What is the wisdom? In a context of possible jealousy and envy and pride and obviously arguing and selfishness and a few other things that we probably just don't have time to identify, Jesus' wisdom. By the way, he doesn't say anything, does he? He first acts and then he says. But his first action is to find a child, which tells you that this is taking place in the public. So what's the wisdom of bringing a child? And by the way, the child would be 12 and under. This isn't a young individual. This would be a child. What's the wisdom of that?
Innocence.
Okay, it could be innocence.
A child is still in the learning stage,
Child is still in a learning stage.
very humble.
Okay, so innocence, I would add purity to that. And then, yes, there's a learning stage, so there's still time to grow, time to mature. Okay, what else?
I have a footnote in my Bible that the disciples were still thinking of that earthly kingdom. So
Yep.
when they're thinking the greatest, they're thinking, well, what's my position going to be in this earthly kingdom?
Yes.
The child just wants to be included, just wants to be part of it.
Yeah.
And there's no sense of first, last. They're just happy to be with everyone else.
Yeah. That's a great point. Were you raising your hand, Michelle?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, especially at that time, children were kind of at the bottom of
Ah.
the earthly hierarchy in that society, and putting a child there would kind of draw their attention to someone who doesn't have any power.
Yeah.
They're thinking about the hierarchy and power and prestige, and a little child at that point would be, just a, yeah.
Go ahead.
That's the nail on the head. I mean, you need to stop thinking about self at that point, and you need to teach. And so therefore, things have to slow down, and the attention turns on to the child. So if you accept this child, then therefore you're taking on that responsibility.
Yeah, great point.
My ox
something I never thought of before in these words. It says, receiving the little child requires generosity without expectation of gain. It's all cost.
It is. It's all cost.
That was interesting.
No, it is. And all of these answers are right. And he is teaching a very profound, and he's going right at pride. He's going right at selfishness. He's going right at jealousy. He's going right at he's digging up the rocks and he's cutting out the thorns. You want to know who's great in the kingdom? The most insignificant person is the greatest in God's kingdom. Because a child, from a human point of view, is the most insignificant person in the first century. So you want to be great? Embrace being insignificant. That's opposite. Embrace, you want to run away from being significant and embrace being insignificant. You want to be the greatest in the kingdom? Put yourself in a position to learn. You want to be great in the kingdom? Be aware of the innocence and the purity I'll give you and how it can be easily lost in a moment of jealousy or anger or selfishness or fill in the blank. You want to be great in the kingdom? Pay the cost. And it's not a coincidence that the last word of Luke 9 is the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I'm willing to pay the cost. You want to follow me and be part of the kingdom? Or you want to pay the cost too? Because it is, are you ready to do that? And are you ready if Philip actually gets the significance and you don't? Are you ready, Thomas, if Matthew gets the significance and you don't? Peter, are you ready if Bartholomew gets the accolade and you don't? Is that okay with you? If you understand the child, object lesson, it is more than okay with you. Because at the end of the day, the kingdom is not about me. The one who is the greatest, he was actually lost in the entire discussion, was he not? And that's what selfishness does. Moving on with verses 51 through 56. So this is a curious thing. We're kind of skipping some parts, and then we'll get into the parable of the Good Samaritan here in a moment. They're just going to combine this curious case. So it says that Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. Again, that's getting close, and he wants to go, just take the short route. We're going to cut through this village of Samaritans and on our way to Jerusalem. And this is really a good little lesson in a devotional. What happens when you're not successful in the mission? Sometimes we can look at Jesus and we think, he was always successful. People always were happy to see him. People always welcomed him. They couldn't wait. They threw parades, where everybody was so excited. They couldn't wait to hear what he had to say. They couldn't wait to hear what he had to do, see what he had to do, all sorts of things. This is one small but very powerful episode that even Jesus is not successful. Even he's not successful. So, why does the village not let Jesus pass through their streets? Why do they not let him make preparations so that he can spend the night and, whatever?
Says because he was on the way to Jerusalem.
So tell me what that means. What does that mean? He's going to Jerusalem, but remember, it's a Samaritan village. So yes, ma'am.
But it says that the Samaritans refused Jews that were headed to Jerusalem.
Okay.
They wouldn't allow them to stay in that territory.
Yeah.
Those two groups didn't get along anyway, so they refused to.
And why did they, and I'm glad you mentioned this, why did they not get along? Why did Jews and Samaritans not get along?
They were partially related.
Okay, they were partially related.
The Samaritans kind of like some sort of pagan group.
Some parts.
Kind of took inspiration from God. From, I don't know, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah, some parts of them for sure did that. Not the entire group, but there were some extreme parts that did that. They did. So they were mixed. They were a mixed race. So they were not pure from a race. So it's not going to say it in the text, but it's a racial thing. And it's also a worship-based thing. So you mentioned the Samaritans. The Samaritans believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Everything else was up for grabs. Jews believed in all 39. So we're going to argue about worship. We're going to argue about where to worship. We're going to argue about all of that. And then just for the simple fact that you intermarried or intermingled with Gentiles, you did this. So we're going to look down on you. And this is what's going to happen. Well, eventually, just from a human standpoint, what is that going to naturally create? If one race looks down on another race, animosity. If one group looks down on another group for worship practice or interpretation or whatever it is, it creates the animosity. It creates the hatred. It creates the division. And quite simply, this is a role reversal. Because if the shoe was on the other foot, would a Jew let a Samaritan pass through? So this story is about when you have power, what do you do with it? Use it and abuse it. And in this case, and this is the Joseph story all over again. When Joseph had his dreams and his brothers had the power, what did they do with Joseph? They wanted to kill him, but they ultimately did what? And about 20 plus years later, when the shoe is on the other foot and Joseph actually has all the power and his brothers are at his mercy, what does he do with it? He uses it for their benefit. If a Samaritan will look and say, you shouldn't be surprised that we're not going to let you pass, because if the shoe was on the other foot, you wouldn't do this. One of the things that we need to remember when it comes to our place in the world, inside with each other, our place in the world, some days and at some moments, the shoe will be on the other foot and we'll be at the mercy of other people. And some days and in some moments and in some circumstances, they will be at our mercy. And the question is when that happens, who you will be when that happens. Who will I be? And not just who will I be, but if I am a follower of Jesus, will Jesus shine through or not? Will Jesus come through or not? Because if he doesn't come through, I will end up taking the power, whatever that may be, in that context, and it will not be used for the other individual. So, speaking of that, James and John, because Jesus at the beginning of the chapter had given them power, remember that. How do they react and what do they want to do to this village? It's a lot. Everybody knows what they want to do. Just one person, if you don't mind. Tell me, how do they react and what do they want to do? So they
burn the place up.
okay, so they actually live up to their name, sons of thunder. Some of you have a translation that would call them sons of wrath. So this is part of their personality. Quick fuse, short temper, whatever that may be. And then the request is, hey, do you want us to call down fire? We hadn't done it, but I'm pretty sure we got that power to do it. Now, let's just look at this for a moment from objectiveness. Where in the Old Testament would they have gotten that concept from? Sodom and Gomorrah? Nadab and Abihu? Elijah and the prophets of Baal? What does God do to his enemies? With? And even after, appointed for man to die once, and after this, the judgment, if we're full of sin, where are we going? A place of eternal fire where the worm doesn't, all of that. So fire is used to consume, rightfully so. So if you're James and John, let's just put their kind of short temper to the side for a moment. I don't want to give them a pass, but you at least understand why that's their first thing, at least in my mind. These guys rejected you. These guys are doing this. Let's just do what we did in our history. Were you raising your hand?
History, just because I've been reading about Solomon a lot in the last 3 months. After Solomon's reign, it was Samaria that was the center of the northern kingdom, and there was Judah, where Jerusalem was the center of the southern kingdom. The the southern kingdom was just 2 tribes, and the northern kingdom was 10. And it even says that some of the faithful moved from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom, because that's where Jerusalem was. That's a long story to say. I can see over history that the south, the wilderness, Jerusalem and south, that's where the righteous people are. All the 10 tribes in north that didn't have the lineage to look over them as king and intermingled with the nations around them, those are the impure ones. That's where all Jesus came from Nazareth. And so that whole area, unfortunately, probably had a built-up reputation of they're not with us.
Yeah.
Basically, there's 3 stories here about who's with us and who's not.
Yeah.
And those Samaritans aren't with us.
Yeah, they're not with us. And partially what would ingrain that as well is the fact that Jews ultimately proved to be right, Jerusalem being the worship place. And so that reinforces this concept. Not only you're not with us, but we're right. And until you're willing to admit you're wrong, even that goes a little bit further down. And that just comes from Jesus with the discussion with the Samaritan woman at the well. Go ahead.
Should we read any significance in that it was James and John that said this, because they were at the Transfiguration? We know they were part of the discussion about who's the greatest. Jesus used the child, and this occurs, and they pipe up again, sons of thunder and things, but then Jesus talks about, right after that, the cost of discipleship.
Yep.
So they didn't get the first lesson, evidently. And I'm just thinking the arrogance of what they saw versus, hey, we've seen it all, we can do anything.
Yep.
John is also in verse 49, which is a completely different story about who do we accept and who not.
Yeah. They're not part of our inner circle. You want us to tell them to stop. So you're right, all three of this. So the greatest should be among us. That if they're not part of our circle, they're not to be counted. And then obviously if they reject. And I don't know if you can go too far into it, because they probably mean well in this, would be my guess, just to be a little bit easy on them.
I'm gonna have to give them some credit for having the faith that they
Call down fire. Yeah. Yeah.
On the other hand, why do they think that Jesus needs help to do that? Because he could have done that before they asked.
Sure.
Like, if he wanted to do that, they should know that he would have done it already.
Yeah. So there's a lot, and of course I think that probably ties into the short fuse and probably why they're the ones that do this, because it's just don't talk to us, don't treat him that way, don't treat him. You treat me that way, that's fine, but don't treat him that way. So that probably aided in that, and just going with that. So what does Jesus say to them in response? Were you raising your hand, Miss Pam?
I think it's kind of humorous that they would look at Jesus and ask him
Yeah.
if he wants them to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, why would they not think Jesus could take care of it by just lifting his little finger?
Yeah. And again, it's the irony of the whole chapter, with the whole backdrop of the chapter. With but a word, he stopped a storm. With but a word, he fed 5,000. With but a word, he cast out a demon that the others couldn't do. So sure, if I wanted to wipe them off the face of the earth, I could have done that. And he would have been justified to do that. So go ahead.
You possibly could go back to the Jessica reason is that they're not thinking spiritually, they're only thinking physically.
Sure.
And because they are living in a physical presence as the Lord, then they want to react as they would protecting their king. And so whatever we need to do, we're going to do it. And anytime people get into power, you have those that it goes to their head, and you have those that know how to handle it. And at this point, he's asking them of what spirit you are. Are you of an earthly spirit, or are you really physical to the point that you don't understand spirituality at all?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, to me, he's getting down to the nitty-gritty, trying to teach them, this isn't anything about what you see around you. The kingdom is going to be somewhere other than here. It's not here on earth. And you're trying to defend something that you can't defend, because it's already defended.
Yeah.
There's no way to destroy it.
There isn't. And of course, Matthew goes a little further when Peter makes the confession, on this rock I'll build my kingdom, my church, and the gates of Hades won't prevail against it. But you're right. And to take all three, and I skipped the other one for the sake of time, but to bring that in, and Bailey mentioned this, the kingdom is far bigger than what you would imagine. The kingdom is a lot lower in terms of status than what you'd imagine. And actually, even when it comes to enemies, perceived or otherwise, the kingdom operates in a whole lot of a different way. He's already taught them, and we skipped over it, but he's already taught them. And what we know of as the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it said, you will hate those who hate you. I say to you, love them. Pray for them. Bless them. Do good to them. It is not a coincidence that he rebukes the two and doesn't say a word to the village. You notice the silence of that? And you alluded to this. Some manuscripts do have the New King James has that, a few others, where he asks a very pointed question for the purpose of a rebuke. I want to know what kind of spirit you got in you. Because whatever that spirit is, that's what you're going to use. That's what's going to influence your use of power. So let's pretend you did have the power to call down fire from heaven. And it's just this little village. What are you going to do to the city of Jerusalem when they crucify me? When does calling down fire ever going to stop once you finally use it? You're going to vaporize your enemy? Is that just what we're going to do from here on out? Because you do it once, it gets easier to do it again. And again, and again, and again. Yes, go ahead.
I think also what you mentioned is that there have been many that have believed and have been baptized and added, but as we all know, not all have been faithful. So when you look at the number of faithful compared to the other parts of the world that don't believe in Christianity at this point, like you said, they're outnumbered, greatly outnumbered. And so it's like taking the Word of God to a foreign continent who's never heard it before, and you have 30 people, then you have 60 people. Well, that divided amongst how many is in that continent is very few. So you're at the bottom of the total pole as far as any power or any influence unless what you can use.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, again, in this part, he's trying to get them to stay strong in the faith and what he's taught them, that we need to continue on after I'm gone. Because if you're going to walk around trying to destroy everything, that's not what my gospel is about.
Mm-hmm.
My
Yep.
gospel is about saving souls. And we can't save them if you kill them.
No?
You know?
You're absolutely right. We cannot save them and the thing would be is what they rejected. Well, maybe today they did. You have no idea what they will do down the road. None. We will learn in the book of Acts there will be a man, most likely the same age as Jesus, who will go around and kill Christians. He will meet the Lord, and 3 days later he will become his greatest ambassador. If you eviscerate the enemy, you're go ahead and deciding, not just now, but forever, that they're not worth anything. This is why but to embrace the insignificance. The pride is, we're significant. Jesus, you're significant. Don't let them talk to you that way. Don't let them treat you that way. You know what? We're a kingdom of children. Of course we're going to let them treat us that way. Because it's about salvation. So you know what? If we're regulated to the kids' table, we're regulated to the kids' table. And if they reject us, there's another village. And we'll go there. But who knows? Who knows that when Philip goes in Acts 8 to Samaria, whether this village is among those who convert? If Philip goes and this place is already eliminated by fire, do they even have a chance? Your worst enemy, the person you least like the most, is still loved by Jesus. And he will go to Jerusalem to die even for that village of Samaritans. I will say this, the shoe will be on the other side, will be on the other foot. And when that happens, there's something that's going to guide us. There's something that's going to influence us. And if it's, don't talk to me that way, don't treat me that way, don't do that to us, we destroy bridges very easily. The shoe will be on the other side. It will be on the other foot. And when it happens, what will we do? That's why the entire chapter ends with, are you willing to pay the cost? Are you willing to suffer the shame of rejection? Are you willing to suffer the shame and sacrifice the right to pay somebody back for treatment? Are you willing to suffer all of that? Are you willing to pay that price and say, you know what? That individual, that family, that group, I'm going to let the Lord handle that. Because today's a day of salvation, not of condemnation. It's not for me to decide whether you deserve another opportunity or not. Nor is it for me to decide who's in or who's out. Are you following Jesus? You do what he says, you're in. It's not for me to decide that. It's not for me to look around and point the fingers in any of that. It's not for me to decide who's the greatest. And if it is, the greatest sacrificed his entire life. So when James and John pop back up and they ask for a seat on the right and the left, he finally squashes it. Are you ready to drink the cup I'm going to drink? And are you ready to be baptized with the baptism I'm fixing to go under? Because if you are, by all means, take the right and take the left. Power, what we do with it, is going to be influenced by who and what is inside of us. And if we have more rocks and we have more thorns and we have more of an earthly perspective, we will rain down fire with our words and with our actions. And that, I loved your line, Terry, that is not the gospel of Jesus. So that works in your home, that works with your family, that works among us, and it works among the people in the world. This is what he did. This is what we ought to do too. So be ready next week. Look through the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's where we'll be at. We'll touch on a little bit at the beginning of chapter 10 because somebody does want to say, well, they still rejected, yes. But that's going to be down the line, and that's for the Lord to handle down the line. And he'll mention that at the beginning of chapter 10. But be ready to discuss the parable of the Good Samaritan next week, Lord willing. Glad you're here tonight. The class is yours.